And otherwise, hi, welcome, thank you for being with us. So um, before we get into things, I just want to do a quick land acknowledgement. I'm coming to you from the colonially known land of Seattle, which is the land of the Duwamish people in Coast Salish territory. I want to invite everybody to take a second to acknowledge the land that they're on, to make sure that you are finding out how to be in right relationship with the people of the land that you're on. Here in Seattle, the Duwamish people are still fighting for federal recognition. And so I highly encourage you to check out their campaigns around that, and to check out whatever campaigns, whatever money people are asking you to give, how to be in right relationship with the people who are making sure that you have land to grow your food, that you have water to drink, that you have air to breathe, because it is not a given. As we are experiencing more and more, I just want to make sure that folks have that ability. All right. So can y'all join me in a very brief grounding? I can only see a couple of faces, so I need a little bit of participation so I can see what's going on. All right. All right, give it to me. So I just want folks to get into their senses. I want you to take a second to drop into your body. Take a big deep breath. Take 2 more deep breaths at whatever pace you need. And as you continue to breathe, start to notice what you hear around you, what you smell, what taste might still be in your mouth. Maybe you just had a little bit to eat. Maybe you still got some lingering from breakfast. Maybe you didn't brush your teeth yet and you can taste it. Who knows? But get into that feeling and let it be. Be okay with that. And start to notice, what do those different senses do inside your body? What starts to come up for you? As we do this work, I think it's really important that we start to sense what moves us, what changes us. When we have these conversations, we don't want to just have them in a box. We don't want to just have them in Zoom. We want to take them out into the world. And part of how we know what stuff stands out to us, what comes up for us, is being in tune with what happens inside of our bodies when we talk about these things. And to different levels, to different experiences, we're going to have and feel all kinds of different things. And so whatever comes up for you, let it come through. If you would like support in making sure that those things are met, that your needs are met, please let us know, and we'll try to make sure that that's done as best possible. All right. So a little bit about the conversation that we're having today. So the Disability Justice Project at the Transgender Law Center pulled together this conversation to lean into some of the tensions around mandatory reporting. The tensions around mandatory reporting have come up more recently because of some of the things that have been happening in Texas and throughout the country due to Governor Greg Abbott's issue, the executive order in Texas requiring mandated reporters to report trans kids to CPS. In this conversation, we're going to take some time to break down what mandatory reporting really is and how it harms marginalized identities, people with marginalized identities. So we're really going to talk about how it impacts the intersections of Black folks, Indigenous folks, queer and trans kids, disabilities, all of these different things, so that we can really make sure that we're having an intersectional lens when we're having conversations about how people are impacted by mandatory reporting. All right. So one thing that we did want to note and make sure is that we talk about what this conversation is not. This is not legal advice. You cannot take this information and go somewhere else and say, well, the Transgender Law Center said that I could say this and I could do this, because that is not what we're doing here today. So I just want to make sure that if you do need that kind of support, that you contact the Transgender Law Center, and somebody will put that information in the chat so that we can all be taken care of, and so that you can get your needs met outside of this, all right? So all of that being said, again, welcome everybody. My name is Chapman. I just want to let you all know that I'm coming to this conversation as someone who sees their liberation inherently tied up with trans children, and wanting to see the safety of all of our people and knowing that all of us are going to be impacted by mandatory reporting. But I'm also not coming to this conversation as the expert. That's why we have these wonderful panelists here. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about who they are, and then let them really tell you about what mandatory reporting is and how we're going to keep each other safe, without using systems that can create more harm for us. So first, we have Ericka Ayodele Dixon. Ericka is a Black queer disabled person currently serving as a Disability Project National Organizer at the Transgender Law Center. Ericka is first and foremost an educator, writer, and facilitator, and has an extensive experience developing curriculum and training based on the intersections of disability justice, racial justice, and gender justice. As a survivor of sexual violence themselves, Ericka believes that this work is deeply personal and that this work is both deeply personal and political and grounds everything they do using queer Black feminist lens. Ericka holds a master's in international affairs from Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs and a BA in culture, society, and human rights from Emory University. Ericka, do you want to say hi to the people?
There, thank you. Hi, everyone. Really excited to be here. Really excited for this conversation. And just great to share space with Shannon and Victoria and Paris and represent the Disability Project at the Transgender Law Center.
Love. So everybody give it up for Ericka. Send all the love. Give a little bit of emoji love. And next, we have Victoria Copeland. Victoria received their MSW from UCLA and is currently a senior policy analyst working at the intersections of technology, policy, and social welfare. Their work seeks to understand the use and impact of surveillance and decision-making processes, specifically within the child welfare system, criminal legal systems, and housing. Victoria is also an organizer and member of Cops Off Campus Coalition, Let's Get Free LA Coalition, and Defund MPD Coalition. Victoria, want to say hi to the people?
Yes, hi everyone. So grateful to be here and share space with everyone and to learn together.
Awesome. Also give the love, pump it up, give us joy. Move however you move. Okay. So finally, we have Shannon Perez-Darby, a founding member of the Accountable Communities Consortium. Shannon Perez-Darby is a queer, mixed Latina, anti-violence advocate, author, and activist working to create the conditions to support loving, equitable relationships and communities. Shannon centers queer and trans communities of color while working to address issues of domestic and sexual violence, accountability, and prison abolition. As a current activist in residence at Just Beginnings Collaborative, Shannon is supporting the Mandatory Reporting is Not Neutral project to share survivor stories about the impact of mandatory reporting, educate communities on harm reduction practices, and change the conditions that lead to violence and abuse. Shannon, let the people know.
Hello, it's so nice to be here with you all, and thank you, Paris, for that lovely introduction. I got a little sneak peek of our conversation we all got to meet, and I'm really excited to be in conversation with you all this afternoon.
Awesome. So we're going to do a lot of talking about mandatory reporting and what it is. And what I want to do before we get into all the questions is just take a second to ground us and ask the panelists to tell us a little bit about why does this matter to you and how is this connected to your own liberation? So if you have ideas about that, if you want to take a second to breathe and let us know. That is an open question to all panelists. But Shannon, since you're my friend, I'm gonna ask you to go first.
Hello, thank you, Paris. Of course, I am happy. I'll say any of the things you want me to say. Yeah, so how I found myself into spending a lot of my time talking about mandatory reporting, which is not when I think about my like young queer self, what she thought she would be doing with her time, I don't think it was spending time talking about mandatory reporting. I found my way here by spending a lot of time supporting queer and trans young people experiencing violence. Trying to get creative, trying to show up, trying to be in support their leadership and their visions for what they needed, and getting really clear about what was best supportive for those young people experiencing violence, which was getting to be in charge of their own stories, which was having people in their lives and their communities that could talk about harm they were experiencing where they were in control with what happened, and resourcing young people in their leadership. And really quickly, the reality of mandatory reporting became clear that that was sitting in direct tension with what we knew was best and what we knew those young people wanted for themselves. And here I am like 12 years later, still trying to be like, what are we going to do about that plan? What are we going to do about the tension with what we know is best, what we know communities need, survivors need, and the realities of the state-based system that requires people to report certain harms to government-owned and run entities. And we know that's not a good plan for most of our communities. And so trying to really bring what is often a misunderstood, often just like foggy and unclear thing. So many mandated reporters know they're mandated reporters and can't tell you a lot more else about exactly the details of it, get no training. And we know that anything that's foggy and unclear like is not going to be the best plan for our communities. So a lot of my work is trying to just like take some of that fog away and to bring in clarity and to like bring into a larger conversation these tensions and build meaningful, realistic supports for folks experiencing violence that don't rely on harmful state systems. So that I will stop talking.
I gotta ask to be off of mute, so I can go. Yeah, I don't have I mean, I could talk about how I got brought to this work all day, but I think to say it succinctly, I can't come to this work from experience, not only in my own personal life and my family, you know, seeing people die way too early, the Black women in my family die way too early, seeing my family be put under surveillance and people I love being put under surveillance for many different reasons, you know, for being Black, for being Filipino, for, you know, being caught up in the criminal and justice system. And so, you know, these experiences really bring me to this work. And so, although I focus on child welfare specifically, because of my family experience and experiences of, you know, my peers and loved ones in my community, I think that we're talking about so many intersections between different systems, between you know, the criminal legal system, child welfare, housing, social services. We're talking about all these things. And for me, it's really important for us to all continue to talk about this together and know that we're not alone in facing these different systems, and to really build support and, you know, love and care for one another. So that's what really brings me to the work and continues my motivation and inspiration. And just like you all, I have my notepads and pens because I'm learning with you all and from the panelists today, even though I'm here sharing as a panelist myself. So.
Great. Yeah, I think I'm coming at this conversation, like both Shannon and Victoria, from a mix of, you know, like personal experience. I was a teacher in elementary school, special education teacher, and something that they don't prepare you for when you're a teacher is that you are a mandatory reporter and you do have to make calls. And I remember being told, you know, that if you are questioning if you have to call, then you call. And that was from like my supervisors, principals, and I was 21 years old, and I saw firsthand how actions that I took, that I was doing in essence to try and protect my kids, ended up having really harmful effects on my kids. And so that was kind of my first foray into really starting to understand how these systems, or specifically how the child welfare system is set up, in a way that really is here to surveil, to criminalize, to punish Black and brown families, queer and trans families, low-income families, disabled families, and getting more into my abolition work and organizing, really starting to put two and two together and realize that a lot of what's being left out of the conversation is disability justice, is the fact that disabled people have been pushing against these systems forever. And now with this escalation against like trans kids, we really have a lot that we can learn by amplifying disabled leadership in these movements, and really have an opportunity here to do a lot of cross movement organizing that could be really dope and transformational. So I'm excited to be part of this conversation. I also wanted to pause really quick because I want to make sure that folks know that we do have ASL interpretation. We do have closed captioning that I think is available. And we have a Spanish language line as well for simultaneous interpretation.
Thank you so much for all those notes. So the reason why I asked that question is just so that we can all recognize that like this journey is a journey. None of us are coming into this work and saying, we know the exact way to do this for every single situation, but we do know that there has been harm already happening. And that is what we're here to talk about, is how do we mitigate all of the different challenges, all of the different harms that may come up, and move towards something that actually creates safety and liberation for our people. So how do we move that into practice? And so the first question that I have is going to be for Victoria. And it's really around us knowing that we talk about abolition oftentimes, we talk about these things as high level ideas, but we want to kind of move into how do we apply that here in this conversation. So oftentimes we'll see it applied to the criminal legal system, but people aren't always thinking about how does abolition affect child welfare? So do you want to give us some information on how do those things connect?
Yes, and this is Victoria speaking. I just saw the comment for us to announce who's speaking, so it's Victoria. And I'm gonna get more specific into the child welfare system, but I did want to read this quote from Mariame Kaba's book. Mariame Kaba is someone who I've learned a lot from, beginning my journey, not really beginning, but continuing my journey towards an abolitionist praxis or view, theory. And so I'm just going to read this quote really quick. Mariame says, abolition envisions a world where we address harm without relying on the violent systems that increase it. A world where we have everything we need: food, shelter, education, health, art, beauty, clean water, and more things that are foundational to our personal and community safety. And I really love this quote from Mariame Kaba, because I think that a lot of times when we hear abolition, not only is it this really big thing, but it's also always attached, or not always, but frequently attached to the criminal legal system or prison, incarceration, things like that. But I think that what Mariame Kaba and other abolitionists call us to do is to think about not just the institution of policing, but different forms of punishment and violence, criminalization that have expanded into these different systems. And so for us, it's really looking into what are these foundational ideas or the rationale for funneling people into these violent and abusive systems. And so for me, that is a clear connection into the child welfare, or what people, or I specifically have called it, family policing system, because the system has really utilized the same sorts of logics or tactics, if you will, that the criminal legal system uses. So they've surveilled families, they criminalize women, children, as you've seen in Texas, using the same sort of logic or standard that they use in the criminal legal system. They track families generationally, and then they also harm children and parents while they're in the system. So once the child welfare system basically comes and investigates your house or your family, you kind of get stuck in this cycle in which you're either experiencing family separation or constant surveillance. And so when we see children being removed from their homes, even some of them, or a lot of them that are Black and Brown, also experience abuse in these other foster homes and adoptive homes as well. So for me, it's really making these connections between that logic and these tactics of power that are used across different systems. And so I think abolition calls us to look at how these different systems are connected and how they mimic each other.
Thank you so much. There's all these connections that you're drawing remind me of how systems creep into a community and then even sometimes like become what we may identify and think is our culture. And being able to tease those things apart and make connections is really powerful for making sure that we don't end up becoming our oppressors. So I really appreciate that perspective. So drawing connections again, Ericka, there are some connections between this work, between abolitionist work and disability justice and trans justice. Can you help us understand that?
Yeah, for sure. I think one thing that's really important for folks to understand, because I know that, we're using these kind of like big words like abolition and transformative justice and things like that, that this also isn't an abstract conversation, that these things are like our communities are really under attack and under a very synchronized attack from the state, and that these frameworks that we're sharing and that I know all of us are trying to really implement in our daily lives are to combat that attack. And so it's wanting to like drive that home for people. And I think something with disability and abolition, what we're really trying to get folks to understand and see is that the child or the family policing system, I really like that framing. Thank you, Victoria. And I'm so sorry, this is Ericka. I announced my name beforehand and I talk very fast when I get nervous, so I might slow down. But something that in disability community, we really are trying to push is an understanding that the family policing system, that mandatory reporting, that these systems are further forms of incarceration for disabled people. They further push disabled people and trans disabled people into further isolation and further harm. And when we think about abolition, and because as a society, and again, thank you, Victoria, for naming different logics that we're operating under, right? And so we are operating under a logic of eugenics. And I think a lot of times people think of eugenics and eugenic logic as something that happened, last century and centuries before, and that we're not operating in a eugenic logic currently, but we are. Whenever we talk about creating systems and policies that are designed to annihilate and destroy an entire group of people, we are talking about eugenic logic, which is inherently ableist. And so when we think about abolition and abolishing the systems of harm and violence, particularly through the state, we really have to be also looking at it from what is the eugenic logic that is here and how do we abolish that, and recognizing that a lot of times in a lot of abolition work, because we as a society, don't see disabled people, we don't want to acknowledge disability, we don't want to acknowledge people's bodies who are different. We really want to make sure that in this future where we have what we need, where we have dignity, where we have care, we have disabled people. And if we don't tackle ableism, as well as in abolition work, then we're not really going to reach liberation. And so for me, abolition is inherently disability justice, it's inherently trans justice and trans liberation, because we need all of us to be in the future. And it's not even just a need, it's a demand. We demand that we're going to be here.
Yes, yes. Make all the connections and bring time, bring history with us. I think it's really important that when we have these conversations that we aren't just rooted here, that we're also talking about how the past is now the present and we didn't leave it there and it's going to get carried into the future if we don't find a way to stop it. So thank you. One of the things that I wanted to also ask about from you, Shannon, is like all the assumptions that are made around what mandatory reporting is and all the assumptions about who it keeps safe and what Governor Greg Abbott has been telling about who it keeps safe. So just want to ask you to elaborate on that.
Yeah, of course. This is Shannon. If there was one thing that I would love people to be able to understand and internalize when it comes to mandatory reporting, I think it's the idea that the mandated report itself is not a support. It's not a resource. The report is just a report. And what I find sometimes when I talk about abolishing mandatory reporting is that even people who are otherwise critical of the state and critical of state violence get really afraid and get really resistant to say like, well, no, we can't get rid of that. It's going to hurt children if we get rid of the mandatory reporting. They need those resources. And what I always try to pause and say is like, the report is not, it's not support. The report isn't the resource. The resources are things that we can have alive and abundant in our communities that shouldn't have to be tied into the literal policing that comes from mandatory reporting. And the really important word in mandatory reporting is the mandate part. So there are a lot of ways to get to the kinds of supports we need, but the simplest concept of mandated reporting is that it requires certain people, usually certain kinds of workers, to make reports regardless of whether they assess or think that report is going to be supportive or needed or wanted. So even if you think it is harmful, that system requires you to make that report. And asking people to do a thing under sometimes penalty, like a criminal penalty that you know is going to be harmful, like we can do better than that. And so we could get rid of just as a base, the mandated part of mandatory reporting. And that's not even getting rid of all the harmful systems. Like I want to do that too. But like sometimes when I talk about abolishing mandatory reporting, like just keeping it right sized, it's actually like literally just getting rid of the mandate to report, even if you think it's not helpful. And that the confusion about mandatory reporting, because it is state by state, it can look so different, often results in people over-reporting. So in the lack of any clarity or more information about that, it's a place where we put all our anxiety on. And people have a lot of misconceptions, including that anything that's harm or anything that's a crime is a mandated report. And in many places, mandated reporting requirements are much more narrow. So they usually have things like child abuse or neglect, self-harm, sort of this category of imminent threat or harm, but it is not everything that's a crime and it's not everything that would be experienced as harm you're required to report. So even the lack of understanding the laws that currently exist result in that people make these reflexive reports and people over-report, and they make reports based on liability. So they make reports so they don't get in trouble, not so that a person who's experiencing harm gets support. That's actually just usually not the motivation. That's our imagined motivation. You know, I hear a lot, actually also Miriam Kaba talk about sort of this like the propaganda and this idea, this like magical idea that we have that like these altruistic systems are going to be there with support, and it's literally just made up. what you're doing when you put people into those systems is that even if you have best assumption, like even if you have like a child protective service worker who is resourced, who cares, who's trying to support, they are working inside a system that is often overstressed, overexhausted, with caseloads that are actually inhumane to actually be able to even manage, even with like the best intent, and with very minimal tools. And so you have to take the context of mandatory reporting in its actual reality, not in our made up idea that the report will equal support. Because what we know is that one of three categories is likely. One is that literally nothing might happen. So a number of unsubstantiated reports that are happening are going up every year. So it's something like 80 or 90% of reports that are being made now are unsubstantiated, meaning like nothing happens after that report. So we are putting people's information and experiences into these systems to literally not even get any support, even if that's what your goal is. The other thing is really harmful things can happen, like the police can show up at your door and take your children away. You're moving people into interaction with these harmful systems, and that often if people are getting support, it's like happenstance and luck. That we can make systems that actually mean that people can get that support without having to go through those government threshold of these mandated reporting pieces. So if there's anything I could get folks to understand, it's just the report itself doesn't actually guarantee or equal more resource or support for people experiencing harm.
Yes. If everybody could say with me, report does not equal support. If there's anything you want to internalize about what Shannon just said, like it just does not mean that. And I think one thing that was really important to pull up from there is to think about like, what are people motivated by in that system? And I mean legally motivated by, like, are you motivated to actually get the right support for somebody or not to end up in a messed up situation yourself? And I'm not even going to go into all my ideas about criminalization and all the hoops that we have to jump through as people who support people, as human service workers. But just know it's on my mind. So the next question that I want to ask is for Ericka first, and then for Victoria to expand on. What are some of the intersections and impacts of mandatory reporting on disabled people and BIPOC folks and trans youth?
Yeah, I mean, I love like a report does not equal support. I'm gonna keep that as like a sticky note somewhere. So true. And, you know, the impacts that we see, and Shannon started naming some of them, you know, that kids are being separated from parents and then or guardians or in community, right? Like a lot of times, especially in Black and brown communities, undocumented communities, in trans and queer communities, we rely on each other. You know, it's not just your insulated family unit, it's you're relying on your aunts and uncles, you're relying on, you know, your neighbor down the street, you're relying on friends and networks of care. And so when you remove a child, not just from that like insular family unit, but from a whole community, that is incredibly traumatic and hard and creates more harm for kids. And it completely erodes this idea of dignity and self-determination, not just for kids, but for families and for communities as well, which further creates isolation, further creates conditions where harm and violence happen. And we see that all the time, right? And it also, these systems take a toll and are not only policing how families are raising their own children, but also policing like if families can have kids, right? So there have been laws on the books. You know, again, we think of this as being so long ago, but you know, this was in the 70s, 80s that people with certain disabilities in certain states were unable to have children legally, and forced sterilization still happens. We know that. We know that the state is even before getting involved with child welfare, the state is determining who is allowed to have and parent a child through adulthood and who is not. And we, when we involve the child welfare system, the family policing system, it may be at a different time. It may be like after folks have kids, but we really need to think about this holistically, even before looking at the point of CPS, but really thinking about who is deemed fit to be a parent, who is deemed fit to have a family, and what type of kid, what type of family, what type of what does that look like? And that's all being dictated by the state. Yeah, pass it to Victoria.
Yeah, not too much to add. I think that was beautifully stated by both Ericka and Shannon. Again, this is Victoria speaking. I would say that, as Ericka was saying, the child welfare system, family policing system, and specifically mandatory reporting impacts people generationally, and it impacts communities generationally. So, and I don't mean to freak people out on this call, but when you are making a report, it's not just that singular report. So with this expansion of technology, when you make a report, if it's inconclusive even, or if it's substantiated on, let's say, neglect, that gets counted towards a future risk score. And so this risk is just a calculation or a number that's attributed to you, your family, and your kid, that will impact you throughout your entire life, because the child welfare system really has no guards around how long they keep data and how long they are tracking who is high risk. And so these labels of high risk, these flags, are indicated by different factors, whether there was a report on you, whether you have that report was substantiated, if you have any involvement in the criminal legal system, if you get food stamps, all of these other things get culminated into this risk score. And so as people who are expected to make a report and you're being convinced that, oh, do it because you will face legal, or there will be legal ramifications, we also have to consider that this is impacting not only youth and their families, but whole communities for generations. Literally, the people I work with say they're caught in a cycle that they are literally never able to get out of. And that is seriously, that makes me nervous, to report anything that I feel could be handled with just a conversation or just more resources for people generally. So I think that is the one thing that I always try to emphasize to people, that it's not just a singular phone call or written report, that it really, really lasts in the system because of the way that power has been implemented.
Because of how you're saying that there's a lasting impact, there's a generational impact, I think sometimes these conversations can seem new or shocking to people. And so I'm wondering if you, Victoria, and then Shannon, can elaborate a little bit on why this maybe isn't so shocking or new to some people, or who is it shocking and new to, and who is it shocking and new not to? Can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, so personally, when the news of Abe came out, I was obviously disgusted because this is just a violent act. It's egregious in every single way. I wasn't necessarily shocked or surprised because the way that the system functions it's always been weaponized against people, specifically, Black people who have been identifying as trans or who are, queer. It's already been weaponized against communities, but there has not been so much coverage because people think that they're helping, that the system is helping. It's been, we've been sold this narrative that the child welfare system is there to help. And so I think that, with this new bill that came out, I wasn't surprised because there was already a foundation for it to happen. There are already mandatory reporting laws implemented. There was this very discretionary definition of what child abuse and neglect is. So really, you know, the federal government gives states the opportunity to define what that means and looks like. And so because we already have this discretionary standard, it's a free-for-all. If you think about it, states are able to say, oh, you know, gender affirming care, that's child abuse. Being Black right now is basically child abuse, if you think about it. And so I was not at all surprised that it has been weaponized in a new and ugly form. And I think that, you know, the purpose, especially of me being here, is for people to make these connections, that it's not, or I guess rather to call us to not be so reactive when it's weaponized in new ways, but to really critique the underlying foundation of what makes this even possible, and to really get at that, right? So, you know, Abbott was able to weaponize a mandatory reporting law. And so what can we do to upend that so no one is harmed, whether that is queer people, Indigenous people, disabled people, anybody? What can we do to make sure that doesn't happen, and that we don't have the tools readily available to enact this violence? And so that's something that I'm continuing to think about myself.
I think, yes, all of the things that Victoria just said. This is Shannon. And one of the things I found myself thinking a lot about is this sort of the creeping up of these systems, and the very explicit, like, these systems are explicitly racialized and explicitly used against Black, against Native, against other other communities of color, and in some ways this piece of like the shock when, like, you know, when those systems that are utilized against other folks. So seeing like a lot of white, queer, and trans people being like, oh, whoa, weird, that's horrible. Like, absolute welcome. Yes, absolutely it is. We should all be urgently concerned about the crushing nature of these systems. And like, we need all of us to care about that. In Washington State, one of the things that we're seeing is this pressure from carceral feminists. I don't even know, it's like a lot of the anti-trafficking folks particularly, to expand mandatory reporting. So there was a bill, one of the ways that mandatory reporting has changed in Washington State was adding commercial sexual exploitation to the list of things you were required to report about as mandated reporters. So one of the few ways it had been expanded was by the sort of, I won't go into all the details, but the wacky anti-trafficking stuff, using that as a like very carceral way to say, great, yeah, like it is a crime and we should report that, with no critique or understanding of the harms associated with that. And so just watching sort of that carceral creep is just like, you know, just anytime we get in there and it just keeps expanding and growing and growing. And how do we, you know, a lot of the strategies that my communities have been using are harm reduction, and I see a lot of the questions in the chat, and you know, and my hope is we can get to some of the pieces about like what are the harm reduction pieces. So this piece around how to just like turn down the dial of harm in the reality of like the systems we have now, but also like what can we do to set up the conditions to make different systems? And I actually do believe that is possible. Like, I do actually think that like in the light of day, this tension around the reality of mandatory reporting and the concept and the imagination of mandatory reporting, that like when we bring that tension out, like I think it won't stand. I think more and more people can actually be like, wait, that's not right. And we can actually work to doing state by state strategies to just keep turning down the dial of harm associated with that. Yeah, I'll stop there.
This is Paris, and I'm going to slow down my speaking and also say that, Shannon, that is exactly where we're going next. Because people get scared when we start talking about transformative justice and abolition, and they think that all we want to do is burn stuff down. And we know that this conversation is about building stuff up so that we can actually create safety. So my question to you is, what would safety actually look like? How do we create that as a community? And what would it look like for communities to actually have capacity to create the safety that we're asking for? So I'm going to pass it to you, Shannon, and then Ericka, please expand.
This is Shannon. A problem that I have transparently is that what I know and what my communities know about safety for us, people seem to think is magical thinking, or seem to think it's like not real, or like, and so I will say the things over and over again, and people are like, yeah, sure, but like, also what else? And I'm like, were you listening to what I was saying? And what we need is resource communities who have the who are in charge of the meaning making of the reality of our lives, who have both their basic and like complex needs met. We know that strong communities are safe communities. So we know that when harm happens, the more social connections you have, the more helpers, the more people in your life who've got you, the more choice you have. We know that the more choice you have, the safer you are. And so when we exist inside systems that decrease choice, that mean that certain communities, certain folks in communities don't get to be in charge of their own lives and their own resource, that is a dangerous situation for anybody. And so resourcing communities, resourcing each other, strong social connections, strong relationships, like folks having what they need and then getting to be in charge of themselves and their own story and their own information, like that's probably a multi-generational task. And that would get us pretty far to where we need to go. And so, people need to be in charge of their own story, and they need strong communities, and they need resource to for them and their communities to move how they need to move.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. Really breaking that down for folks. Shannon, this is Ericka speaking. And I think something that I struggle a lot with in terms of transformative justice is, I think a big tenet that I really agree with, and that when I started really thinking about it, I was like, yeah, we don't talk about this enough, of transformative justice and abolition, is that as humans, right, we do all have the capacity to cause harm. And folks have differing levels of capacity to cause certain types of harm depending on your privileges and your where you're located in society and the world. But everyone on a human level has that capacity. And hearing so many times folks saying that that's why we don't dispose of people, and that's why we don't want to like push people away, which again, I think that's amazing, and I believe in that as a tenet. And what I struggle with is hearing those same folks saying those things and not even acknowledging disabled people, not even acknowledging the fact that we have been disposing of disabled people, of trans people in LGBTQ community for ever, right? And so really thinking about like, if we want to build a culture and we want to build a society and we want to build these systems that acknowledge that we are all able to cause harm in certain ways, and that we don't want to be disposed of, we don't want to be pushed away, we have to tackle ableism, we have to tackle anti-Black racism, we have to tackle misogyny, we have to tackle all of these ways and supremacy systems that create the logics that we are here today discussing, right? That, it's not that Governor Abbott just woke up one day and was like, you know what, I'm going to target trans kids. It's that there is this logic of, the fact that trans bodies are bodies that should be policed, that should be controlled, that are not normal. And that's the same logic that, allows people to say the same thing about Black bodies, about queer bodies. And so really, I think for me, transformative justice is really getting at those different logics and really making sure that what we're building is inclusive of everyone, and that truly, truly, truly everyone has a dignity and everyone has self-determination and autonomy. Yeah.
Awesome. We're a little bit ahead of time, so I'm going to throw a question for all the panelists. When I think about transformative justice and how it creates opportunities for us to change society and change systems, I think of Adrienne Maree Brown. This is Paris, by the way. I'm going to slow down again. I I think of how Adrienne Maree Brown always talks about fractals. And I also think about how harm and how healing happens on an interpersonal and systemic level. So when you're talking about how to create this healing through a transformative justice lens, I'm very curious as to how you see those two things impacting each other. How do you see systems impacting people and people impacting systems? And that's for anyone to touch on.
I had this weird side trip. This is Shannon. So I worked at a community-based anti-violence org for 10 years. Need a little nonprofit break. And so then I went on this wild trip where I went and worked for the local government for like 4 years. And it was such an important experience to really understand and actually really help me right size, like, y'all, there is just humans over there, and a lot of them have no idea what they're doing. Like, just truly, like, lower that bar, like there. And it was deeply soothing to me, to like the idea of that system and being part of communities who was just like fighting like hell to just avoid the government at all costs. So I just didn't know a lot about the government because I was just always trying to avoid it. And so doing this like insider exploration of being like, well, let's go figure out what's happening over there. Y'all, that like they're just like scrapping along. And so I just like, it actually just helped me just get right sized about like what it is we are doing, and not to undermine the like structural nature of those systems and how harmful they are, but also to get a little bit right sized about like where are harm reduction strategies. And for me, I believe the government is only harm reduction. Like I believe engaging with the government, like that's not where our liberation is going to come. And like we cannot ignore the government, especially when we think about local government kind of work. Like the reality of the impact of those systems on our lives is not ignorable. And so thinking about like not as a place where our liberation is going to come, but as a place of like, how do we want to engage? Where is the resource? Where are the moments for change? There actually is a lot we can do. And this is like building our both and of just being like, getting clear, again, liberation's not coming from there, but like how we engage with the resource of the state. How do we turn down the harm of the state? How do we keep it at bay? How do we like make some space and room for ourselves and our communities? That task just really helped me deeply be soothed about being like, y'all, there's just people just doing all sorts of stuff over there, and they're just humans. And I promise you all, like, we know a lot, and a lot more than a lot of the humans who are just like the actual workers in that work at the government. So hopefully that is soothing to you all, in just the imagination of the state, and then actually like what are the levers we can pull to make better conditions for our communities.
Thank you so much, Shannon. The only response that I have to that is the way that my grandmother looks at me when she smells bullshit. So and that'll take us into our 5-minute bio break. So we will come back in 5 minutes. All right, see y'all in just a second. Smooth jazz, KWJZ. I've been listening to that since I was 4 years old. And I have internalized some things about it, so you're welcome. So coming back, we're going to take some questions from the audience. And I want to say thank you to all the folks who have shared their questions ahead of time and all the folks who are sharing their questions now. We're going to get to what we can. But as we do that, the first question that came up the most was, what can mandatory reporters or people who think they're mandatory reporters do about all that's happening in the world around mandatory reporting right now? And I will throw that question to Victoria first.
I was like in deep thought. Yeah, this is a very loaded question. I think this will range because I think there are things that you can do internally in terms of like this abolitionist journey and thinking about how you yourself address harm in your own life and sort of applying that to how you sort of see or observe others who have been harmed and like how you interact with them. And I think that was personally helpful for me thinking about, oh, when I've been harmed in these ways or I've dealt with conflict, have I relied on government institutions? Have I relied on the police? I haven't. What are the things that actually made me feel supported, and who did I rely on? And I think that was actually one of the most instrumental things that helped me think about a different way to address harm. So I would encourage people to do that, their own individual work in that way. But I think, and I'm coming to this as a social worker, and who is someone who is deeply trained to mandatory report and who knows the power of our roles in institutions, I think it's really important for you to understand that mandatory reporting laws, so laws created from this Child Abuse and Prevention and Treatment Act, this was created by a group of people who literally just sat in a room together and decided that this is what we were going to do. Like, that is actually what happened. The Children's Bureau, a group of largely like white men who worked in the medical profession, they were thinking, oh, like there's this thing happening, this phenomena we see in our world, we need to make everybody report. And that's how it came to be. So imagine the power of us as social workers, as community members, as organizers, as educators, who are very uncomfortable and unsettled with this being the status quo. Imagine the power we could have if we got together and practiced what I think as like mass refusal to really accept this as a norm. You know, what is the power that we have, you know, compared to this group of people who years ago, 50 years ago, actually almost, just got in a room and said, this is how society is going to be. We have the power, or we have the ability to reclaim that power and really stand in solidarity with one another and say, how are we going to refuse this as a way that we're going to address harm? That could look like calling each other in, having meetings, showing up to your board, to town halls. There are so many ways that we can organize around this. You can organize this through labor unions. There's so many ways. We just have to be imaginative about it. And I really am trying to call people into having this conversation and to taking these bold steps to sort of refuse this as a way that we will continue. So.
And this is for anyone to answer. I did want to make a quick note that anyone who wants to add more questions to the Q&A, the button is right next to the chat down below, and you're welcome to add at any time. Shannon, do you mind expanding on what you feel mandatory reporters can do? Or people who think they're mandatory reporters?
Sure. This is Shannon. I wrote a list down. So one is to always safety plan with people when reports are being made. So a thing that happens that really freaks me out is that people make reports and that's the very last thing they do. They don't tell the person about whose information they're sharing with those systems that the report has happened. They don't follow up with resource and support. There is nothing about making that report that means we can't also activate community-based strategies for support, that you can't safety plan about the implications of a report to say like, okay, like what will happen if the cops show up at your house later? Like, who's gonna be there? What kind of conditions are they gonna find? Like, do you need to have your cousin come over so you got some help and backup to like have what you need? Like, how are we safety planning with folks, and that the report should never be the last thing you do if you make a report. The report, again, it's not support. The support is the resourcing, the community support, the helping folks figure out what they want and need, helping people make safety strategies for themselves that help them feel safe and be safe. For organizations and nonprofits and other workers who are mandated reporters, make sure your organization has a plan. So much of like whether this goes real bad or like fine is at organizational places. So because the liability question feels so overwhelming, it's super common that organizations they don't have any training, they have no policies, and they have no plan. And so what happens is that you have like workers who are like, oh shoot, I think I have to make a mandated report. And they have no idea like who on their team can they call to get support? where, like, what information would they have to share? Like, are they in violation of their confidentiality? Is it actually a report that's required? Usually people start asking those questions when a situation comes up, and that should never be the first time you're engaging with that question, because it makes it really hard to be aligned with your values in those moments. And so people start to then take actions that are misaligned with their values, either personally or organizationally, in the kind of panic and time limited nature that this reporting system creates. So make a plan and work to have that plan be as aligned with your values as possible. Do not over report. You should understand the bounds of mandatory reporting in your state, if you have licensure that goes with that, and do not report outside of that requirement. So a gut feeling is not the legal threshold to make a mandated report. A feeling something's not quite right, that is not the threshold. The threshold is clear, knowable information. I'll be vague at that level, but like, I'm not sure, something seems off. You also don't have to go detective something out to be a detective for the state. So if you have a sense that like something's kind of off and you're asking more questions as a mandated reporter might lead to more harm, be aware of that. Be aware of how you can resource folks to share information that they need with folks who aren't mandated reporters, if that is what's going to be right and safe for that person. And value confidentiality. So many workers have a legal mandate to confidentiality for the people they're supporting. Treat that confidentiality as important as the requirement as mandated reporters. So what happens is people like really value to say, well, I'm a mandated reporter and I have to do that. But in many places, like for instance, in Washington state, therapists, domestic violence advocates, many other categories of workers have a legal requirement to not share information without a release of information about folks unless that mandated reporting threshold has been hit. So also, if you're making reports outside the bounds of the mandatory reporting laws in your state, you might be violating the confidentiality of folks. And so you should care just as much about your requirement and commitment to confidentiality as you should about mandated reporting. So to do those things to evaluate, like, is a report actually even legally required? Because the amount of people that are making reports based on their concept or their imagination of the laws and not the actual requirements in your state are really high. So just get right-sized about that, get curious, and get aligned with your values.
Thank you. I'm actually just going to pull up something that you said and connected to from earlier and connected to now. You were talking about being proactive about having that conversation with yourself and your staff. And I think that's really important, because if a person is criminalized for not making a report, that motivation in and of itself is not something that you want to be navigating when you have to decide whether or not you're going to be able to create safety for a person. And I just want to really call that out for people who are mandatory reporters. And then I wanted to ask this question of Ericka. So like, policing kind of gets into systems and then like messes us up, and people think that the police are just the cops. Can you connect for us, how does policing enter all kinds of other systems?
Yeah, I appreciate this question. So yeah, policing, not just cops, and again, incarceration, not just prisons. When we think about places of incarceration, particularly for disabled folks, we're thinking about group homes, where kids, where youth might not even have the opportunity, and it might not even be safe for them to claim a trans identity or a queer identity. And like we're talking about folks who like don't have privacy, who don't have bodily autonomy and the ability to make choices on who's touching them, who's dressing them, who's not, and every single thing is surveilled. And another point of incarceration is like psychiatric hospitals as well. You know, it's a similar thing of everything is being surveilled and everything is being policed and autonomy is being taken away. And so I think that when we're talking about mandatory reporting as well, and we're talking about policing and abolition, we have to go to those places where we don't necessarily always see the harm that's being done. It's the places where we have been taught under, you know, ableist logic and eugenics logic to kind of just not even think about. We need to go to those places and really elevate and create spaces where disabled leadership can be amplified, and not in a tokenizing way, right? Not in a like, oh, we have this disabled person and oh, they're Black and they're trans, so we're great. It's like, no, we need actual like political leadership, actual strategy of folks who, like, we've been doing this work, again, like we've been saying for a really long time, forever. And also thinking about policing, you know, I think it's Miriam Kaba. I feel like I've done a lot of, all the readings are in my head, but you know, there's people talk about like a cop in your head, right? And that we, again, have been conditioned to police each other and to, you know, police like how people show up, and to, you know, make reports about each other in everyday life, you know, thinking about like at work, if something bad happens or if someone feels wronged and they go to HR, thinking about like, what is that policing system, right? Like, what is the, just so thinking about how we're interacting with each other, and really like breaking that down and being really cognizant. Like, Shannon, I really appreciate what you're saying about the more we can create ways that our values and our actions are closely aligned, like that's what creates for me integrity. And that's how we can be in integrity with ourselves and each other. And so I think this whole conversation is, if we have values of safety and dignity and liberation, what are those systems? What are those ways of being with each other? What are those ways of fighting for our liberation that are in integrity with our values and don't cause as much harm? Yeah, that's my thoughts.
Awesome. And Shannon, Victoria, do either of you want to add?
There's a comment that I think only we can see and not everybody, that I actually wanted to read because I think it brings a perfect example of this thing that happens a lot. So the comment says, when I was a therapist, I frequently counseled youth out of telling me things in therapy sessions. If we had a good trusting relationship and I could get a sense of a path they were going down that might lead to a mandatory report, I'd say something like, I need to stop you right there and remind you of this reporting obligation I have before we go forward. It was often appreciated, and then the youth knew I was truly for them, not the system. And that story is a really common, that's the practice a lot of folks use. And that practice of trying to honor self-determination, of saying, hey, I want to be transparent about the reality of my of me being a mandated reporter. And so I want you to have that information. And that I do think that's the best information we have in the systems we have. But the other side of that is now we have just counseled somebody out of sharing about harm that they have experienced with a skillful, helpful person. So who else are you going to if it's not your therapist to talk about violence you're experiencing? Where else is that person actually getting the support they need? So what we've had is like absolutely the harm reduction around the system, but you haven't made sure that person actually got the support they needed around the harm they were sharing with you. And that is the tension of mandatory reporting. And what we know from research that I will put into the chat is that warning does change what people share. So when we give people the warning, it does mean they share less with us. And that is an exact tension of what we know when people are experiencing domestic and sexual violence specifically. What you need is, you may only have one chance to especially for young people, to hear about that harm and make sure they're supported. So if we're all around, especially as adults, training young people to be like, oh, oh, don't say that. Oh, don't tell me. We've actually increased and participated with the isolation and the silencing of like a culture of silencing around violence. And so we actually need to increase the places where we talk openly and safe and contained places about violence folks are experiencing. And many young people don't get that dignity and they don't get that right because of mandatory reporting, because the helpful adults in their life who might be supportive to them are mandated reporters who are all counseling them, you know, to reduce the harm of the system, but to not share. And that, for me, is the fundamental reason why structurally changing mandatory reporting is necessary, because of the exact situation that so many people find themselves in.
Awesome. There's a what's coming up for me is just thinking about how do we actually, like, what are the ways, what are the resources, what are the things that we can do to create safety for people, and centering the well-being of survivors, centering the needs of survivors, rather than focusing on the punishing and policing portion, seems like the direction that we've all been talking about going. And so I wanted to ask this final question about what are the resources? What do they look like? And are there ways that the child welfare system can be a resource, a helpful resource to people? And I'll ask it of Victoria first.
Oh no, well, okay. This is difficult for me to answer because I vehemently disagree with the notion that like the child welfare system can be helpful in any way. I think it's just irredeemable, to be honest, from a social worker and a Black person perspective. It just feels irredeemable. However, I think that if we could minimize and shrink the system, begin to do that work of shrinking the system and its reach, we can reinvest that money, reappropriate that money into these community resources that we so need, right? So if we're talking about, you know, I'm not sure people know, but the number one reason families get involved with the system is because of neglect, or what the system calls general neglect. This can look like a lot of things: a child coming to school looking dirty, a child, you know, there was one social worker who said, oh, there's a child who always seems lonely. So that was a reason to, that was impetus to report. And so, you know, these are the way, there are different ways we could shrink this system, because right now, like Shannon was saying earlier, the system is really a law enforcement agency. It enforces a law. It's not providing supports. So how can we shrink the system in a way that reappropriates the money into the actual community, into the pockets and hands of families who need it? And I think that is the way it could be helpful, honestly, to start shrinking itself, to start making itself less, to start cutting off the reach it has into all of these different systems and all of these different communities. And I think I wanted to add, you know, in determining, you know, safety, and, you know, really getting to what Shannon was saying about safety planning, it's really important for us to ask children up front, or families, what does safety look like for them? I know that when harm has been caused to me, I've had experience with IPV and things like that. It was helpful for me for someone to be like, what would make you feel safe right now? What would make you feel comfortable right now? And that is an immediate way to get to what a child or a family would really want. And we do not ask that. We do not prioritize that question. And I know this is maybe tangential, but I'll add this in. We have to think about who actually gets reported. There have been many families, specifically wealthy white families, who have been able to evade these systems for specific reasons. And so if you are somebody who is reporting specific people, specific communities, that might be a point of reflection as well, to think about, oh no, I might be, you know, reporting certain people while other people might be experiencing things and it's not as visible to you. And so when we're thinking about mandatory reporting, we actually have to think about, oh, these things probably happen to other families and I'm not seeing it. So what is the reason that I feel obligated or needed to specifically report this one instance I'm seeing in front of my face? So that was a little bit of everywhere. I do not necessarily think that the system can help in a beneficial way, I think it's time for us to practice mass refusal and to shrink the system and start reappropriating that money into the pockets of families and directly into communities.
Ericka?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I agree with all of that. And I would add, that our communities have been telling folks what we needed for a very long time. Like trans folks, especially Black trans folks, have been saying, like, we need XYZ to be safe. We need spaces where we are not going to be policed. We need resources. We need access to gender affirming care. And likewise with, like disabled communities, we've been saying this is what we need. Like, we need to have autonomy. We need to be, not even just considered, but to be like understood and known as just as valuable and important in this work. We need, again, to be resourced. And I think I agree with Victoria that at this point, I feel like I'm kind of over telling, I mean, I know that like we need to tell folks what we need, but also like we've been telling folks for a really long time, and what we really need right now is for y'all to follow the lead of Black folks, of Indigenous folks, of brown folks, of queer trans folks, of disabled folks. Like, that's what we need, because we know how we're going to create the safety that we deserve. We know how we're going to care for each other, and that's going to help everyone, right? When we have what we need, it's going to help liberate everyone. So I would say, like, think about, like, hear what folks in Texas are needing. And if you have resources for mutual aid, like, please do that. If you have a trans kid in your life, like, make yourself someone who they might feel safe talking to you about things, if you're within, mandatory reporting and all of that. And like little things like respect pronouns, wear a mask, we're still a pandemic. Like, these are things that we all can do, that it might seem like not connected and out of scope of the conversation, but there's things that will show people that you actually care and that you actually value our lives. And that's what we need. We need folks to show up and actually value our lives and fight for us and fight with us.
Really quick, I just want to hold a moment to really just hold for a second that, like, why do we still have to even question whether or not trans and disabled lives, like, are a part of our movement every day, are showing us the way every day? Like, so I'm just going to take a moment. Everybody take a breath on that and feel whatever you need to feel. But the next time you see a space that's not accessible, I need you to say something about that. Okay, sorry, Shannon.
Oh, no, please do not apologize. This is Shannon, and one of the things that I did want to share, I saw some questions in the Q&A about this. And before I share, I'm not a lawyer. I have literally no legal training. Actually don't have any advanced degrees, not a social worker. I'm a community member and a private citizen who's done lots of thinking about this. Just want to say those things before I say this. And I would like us to get curious about this question around consequences for not reporting, and to get curious about how real that is, and actually really curious. So I will say what I think is that many people overestimate the risk of not reporting, as far as liability, getting sued, having a criminal consequence for knowingly not reporting, having the state come for you or your organization. I think the risk of that for most individuals and most folks, like, working in good faith to support communities, is pretty low. The trick about it is if we all start going around believing that, the state will absolutely ramp up the risk of that, right? The state will use that at some point. So, like, as like individual human working at a program, like figuring out and working like hell to support a survivor, a person experiencing violence, you know, the chances of a criminal consequence or a like financial consequence of that is probably low. But the fear of that and the inability to talk publicly and to like have real talk about that because of the potentially criminalizing and the legal consequences of that actually gets in the way and actually creates a sort of boogeyman of like, well, you're gonna get in trouble. I'm like, oh, okay, are we gonna get in trouble? Like, to just get curious. And you know, I heard Victoria saying that some at the beginning of just like, what would be strategies if we just didn't? And so it's an invitation for all of us to get curious and what it would take to get right sized about those questions of like this liability and the fear of what would happen if we didn't. Just to get curious about that.
Thank you, thank you. So in order to get curious, sometimes we got to have questions that take us in the right direction. So with the last 3 minutes, I'm going to ask our panelists to give us one question that they think is important to be considering in order to mitigate the harms of mandatory reporting. And whoever comes up with their question is ready to go first, go for it. I know, it's like a Pringle. You can't have just one. But those chips are nasty.
This is Shannon. And I think the question I would invite mandatory reporters to ask themselves is, what have I done to make sure a person who's experiencing harm is more supported and more resourced?
Ericka?
I think something I would ask of everyone, whether you're a mandatory reporter, whether you're, you know, an activist or doing this work in different ways, really consider like, why are trans and disabled lives still considered disposable? And what's your own plan to interrupt it in your own life, in your own way?
Yeah, this is Victoria. I think a question for me, especially for those who are mandatory reporters, educators, social workers, is how can you speak with other like-minded people in your profession to practice mass refusal? So what does it look like to stand in solidarity with one another and really push against, you know, our big NASW, so official kind of professional institutions? How do we push against them? How do we push against our local and state governments, and really rally against the other people in power who make the decisions, right? So how can we build momentum and practice this refusal of mandatory reporting and other really horrible, violent acts of surveillance and policing?
Awesome. Give it up for our panelists, y'all. Please give it up for yourselves. Show some emoji love. Show some love in the chat. Show some love for my slurs.
Some love for you, Paris.
Thank
you.
Thank you, Paris.
Of course. I want to thank the Transgender Law Center and everybody who's helped us put this together. I want to thank everybody for being here today. It's 2 o'clock. Go enjoy your lives and keep people safe. See you later.